Welcome to Afrocentricity in New Media in Africa, a monthly series on the status and role of new media in Africa. On today's episode, your host, Dr. Langmia, Professor of Media Studies at Howard University, will be discussing African culture in African media.
All right, welcome to this month's edition of New Media and Afrocentricity in Africa. This is a monthly series that we carried out here on YouTube. The theme of this month edition is African culture and African media. You know, Jim Morrison is an American artist who said that he who controls the media controls the mind. Again, he who controls the media controls the mind. And this reminds me of Thomas Sankara, the late president of Burkina Faso, who once said that he who feeds you controls you. Unquote, he who feeds you controls you. If we look at these two scenarios from an American and an African, it boils down to the issue of the mind, reminding us about the decolonization of the mind, reminding us that when you are the receiving end, especially in the developing countries, and in this case Africa, you need to be aware of the fact that your mind is being controlled. Again, that reminds me of Ali Mazrui, talking about the idea of dependency in Africa. He said, and I quote, "Drink deep or taste not the Western Spring. Drink deep or taste not the Western Spring." What is happening with African culture and the media is pathetic. When you find yourself in every African hotel, and what you watch on TV is either CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, or the sports media, hardly do you really find African media from other African countries being projected. Worst of all, we hardly find the African culture. By African culture here, I mean our dances, our marriages, our divinations, our childbirth ceremonies, our rituals being produced on our national television. Worst of all, our broadcasters adorn themselves in Western suits, speaking in Western accents. Only very few of our broadcasters are reading the news in national languages. And even when they are reading the news in African languages, there are some that have to write those news items in English and then translate on the air into African languages. Hardly do we find our African heads of states addressing the nation using African languages that could be translated into other African languages within the same nation. Again, our African culture and African media are suffering. And as Ali Mazrui once said at the OAU, speaking in Swahili, African heads of state were looking left and right, looking for translation into English and French, the same languages that were used to colonize us. We are doomed. We are doomed because we have given ourselves to Western culture. Again, by giving ourselves to Western culture means that the future of African culture and African media is certainly bleak. Toyin Falola, the most published African on planet Earth, once said here at Howard University that when you watch the fashion parade, when you watch the top African model on African televisions, they are mostly those that have creamed their bodies to look Western. They have creamed their bodies to look Western because that is what sells. What is wrong with the African culture, I may ask? Sheikh Anta Diop, who had once said that civilization, human civilization, started in Egypt. We are making him roll on the ground with tears in his eyes. These ancestors, the Nyerere, the Nkrumah, they are going to hold us accountable for selling our African culture to the West, by replacing our African culture to the West. Even with the presence of new media, we are still not proud of our identity. We are told more often than not that when your identity is stripped away from you, you lose your mind. And in this case, it's not only our identity, it's actually our dignity that have been mortgaged. So when Google is talking about decolonizing the mind, The idea of decolonizing the mind is for us to regain our dignity, because our dignity, the African dignity, has been mortgaged. It has been mortgaged. Why? Because the Western tastes is what sells. The Western tastes is what we long for. In most of our primary and secondary schools, Western cultures predominate because African culture is looked upon as inferior, as primitive. If we continue with this mindset, ladies and gentlemen, and the media that controls the mind, to rephrase Jim Morrison and again Thomas Sankara, if we don't use the mind to promote African culture, then the history of African media 100 years from today is going to reflect the fact that Africa is a mulatto continent, it's a dependent continent, it's a continent that feels so inferior about its own culture, and the future will not be kind to us. And if the future is not kind to us, like Molefi Keita Sante is reputed to have said, that there is not quote-unquote an African university on the continent of Africa. What we have is pan-European university on the continent. Why? Because of the Western curricula that we are following. This Western curricula started with our primary and secondary education. It is time to decolonize our universities. And if our universities are decolonized, then our broadcasters that are being produced in journalism schools and schools of communication will value African culture. And this African culture will be reflected on the television, on social media. There is no reason for me to be on an African hotel watching NTV, watching CNN, watching BBC, covering news item on the continent. There is no single African continent or African country, I beg your pardon, that has a permanent reporter on any other African country that is reporting on a daily basis on issues that affect us in Africa. Most of the happenings on the continent, we rely on Western media. And of course, Western media caters to Western interests. It is time for us to have our Western newspaper reporters, radio reporters, and TV reporters stationed in our African cities to bring us up-to-date news affecting African countries. Again, this has been African Culture and African Media, and thank you for listening. Wish you the best, and to reflect on all this as I see you next month. Thank you.